of learning to gain and appreciate wisdom. The United States Marine Corps puts out. And it's a concept that but a lot of times in my mind, I think back to those commercials where the commercial calls for people to join the Marine Corps, to answer the call. You might be familiar with the Marine Corps hymn that identifies the United States Marines. You might be having heard it before. I think about the lyrics to that song. I don't have them up. Stanzas of the Marine Corps, or at least the first two statements of the Marine Corps in that song, because one of the events that gave the Marine Corps recognition among the branches of the United States military was from two lesser-known wars that the United States actually fought. And so the idea of answering the call from the perspective of the Marine Corps, that idea goes all the way back to almost the very beginning moment of the United States, because of the Marines answering the call in some of America's more lesser-known wars. And that was what became known as the Barbary Wars, which was a series of wars fought between the United States and a group of individuals called the Barbary Pirates on the northern coast of Africa. And the second line of the first stanza of the Marine Corps hymn, "From the shores of Tripoli," is actually written about the United States storming the capital, the Barbary Pirates city that we know today to be Tripoli, in which the basically forced the Barbary Pirates that the Marine Corps answered a call, were so willing to answer the call that they participated in this battle, this series of wars that most Americans had never even heard of. And the first two lines of the Marine Corps hymn come from again two lesser-known battles, two lesser-known wars that the United States was involved in. And I want to think about that from the concept. I'm using that as an example to think about it from the concept now of how God calls us to action as well. But it's an action that we have to grow in our development over time. And that's what we're thinking about this morning with the call for wisdom, looking at the life of Moses, because these three separate accounts represent or show to us how Moses grew, and most importantly, grew in his wisdom and his trust in the Lord. And so we're going to look at this in three different aspects. We're going to first of all begin, if you would turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3, because we look at the call to listen. We're going to see that take place in Exodus chapter 3. We know from the Old Testament that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You don't have wisdom without having a proper idea of knowledge. And so we want to first of all talk about how there are times in which people hesitate to listen to what God says. For a various number of reasons. Sometimes people hesitate to respond to the Lord's call because they are afraid to do so. Sometimes people hesitate because they're not willing to give up what they have in front of them in order to respond to the Lord's direction. And then obviously in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is going to be called by the Lord, and ultimately he's got to make the decision, am I going to listen to what God had to say? And we know that Moses had essentially a listening problem, not from the perspective that he could not hear or that he could not understand what God said. What he heard come from the Lord. Notice in chapter 3, beginning in verse 11. God has already said and told Moses that you are going to lead my people out of the land of Egypt. He's already given that directive. But what we notice from what Moses says in verse 11 is that Moses is full of fear. Verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And we know at this point that Moses has been away from Egypt for approximately 40 years. Yet, nevertheless, after those 40 years, Moses still had a certain fear of Pharaoh, right? And we know that it goes back to Moses earlier in life, at least in part, taking the life of an Egyptian who had abused an Israelite slave, that he ran away. And now God is calling him to go and confront the leader of the people who had sought out to find and kill Moses for his action. And so you notice that he had a listening problem because it's demonstrated by his fear. God had identified himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. Moses, being brought up as an Israelite, would have known about what God had already done for his ancestors. He would have known about how God had helped deliver Abraham to the land of Canaan, how God had preserved Abraham in the process of that. He would have known how God had preserved Isaac, helped him find a wife. And then obviously, eventually, God would preserve Jacob, again, through the very same entity that Moses is being called to now confront. And that, of course, being Pharaoh. But Moses had a listening problem because he simply came to the idea that his fear outweighed what God's directive was. So we not only see that from the idea that he is afraid to go before Pharaoh, but we also know that Moses has a listening problem based on his reservations. Verse 12, God tries to provide comfort. He says, "I will certainly be with you. This shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." And then here comes the reservation, verse 13. "If I go to the people of Israel, and I say that the God of your fathers has sent me to them, or sent me to you, they're going to say to me, 'What is his name? What shall I say to him?'" God provides a directive in verse 14. And Moses is going to be afraid. You move forward to chapter 4. Moses comes up with a reservation. "Look, God, I cannot go before Pharaoh because I'm not a great speaker. I don't have a way with words as other people do." And yet God's going to provide God's going to provide the condition that, Aaron's going to go with him. But the point is that Moses had a listening problem. When God made that call to Moses to lead his people, Moses had numerous reasons why he hesitated to actually listen and follow through. His fear, his reservations kept him, or at least almost kept him, from doing what God said. Now, I want to point this out, that sometimes we do not listen to God's call because things are going very well for us in life. Sometimes people do not answer the call. They reject God's call because things are going well. You think about that from the perspective of Moses at this point. Moses has lived in Midian for 40 years. He has prospered, right? He's married. He's prospered as a shepherd in Midian. He is doing really well in life. And then all of a sudden, God now calls him to, again, give all that up, to now go on this obviously very dangerous task to lead God's people out of Egypt. And Moses naturally probably has some reservations due to that as well, right? It's not just about what I cannot do, but God, think about what also I have to give up to follow after you. And there are a lot of people who do very well in life that ultimately will never answer the call that God gives because they don't want to give up everything that's in front of them. They're not willing to give it up. Yet Moses, as we know, in chapter 4 of Exodus, is going to make the decision Despite his reservations, his fear, despite what he already has, we see his wisdom come out because he's going to answer the call. Obviously, after being reassured by his father-in-law, and Moses grew in wisdom because when he listened to God's call, that's where he learned to have trust and faith in the Lord. And obviously, that would benefit him moving forward. So, in other words, we cannot reject God's call when things are going well. For most of us, life is going well right now. And so we've got to remind ourselves that, we cannot wait till things get bad for us to be followers of the Lord. You cannot wait in that regard. We also see that there is the call to learn. And now we want to jump forward in time to Exodus chapter 32. Moses had delivered the people out of Egypt at this point. And in Exodus chapter 32, we read about another significant moment where he is going to be given the law of God. So Exodus 32, Moses is at Mount Sinai. He is with the Lord. He receives the Ten Commandments. And we know that the people that are basically at the foot of the mountain decide this is going to be an opportunity in which we can rebel against God. This is something that we referred to in the Bible class last week when we talked about the idea of the golden calf, and that's exactly what's happening here. Think about what Moses had gained, though. At this point in time, God had not given to any single human a set of laws that were specific to them alone. At no point in time had God called out a group of people and claimed them as his own like he did the Israelites at this point. And in order to confirm that relationship, God gave to them a set of laws that would be unique compared to what the rest of the world would have to follow. Moses has gained this. He himself gains the knowledge that the people of Israel would soon learn thereafter. That knowledge starts with Moses. And he's given a great blessing. But the problem comes in Exodus 32 and verse 7, that the Lord said to Moses, "Go, get down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that you brought out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And I will make of you a great nation.'" Now think about where Moses is at now at this point. He's given the law, and he's been informed by God that despite your best efforts to get this people out of captivity, through the plagues, through crossing the Red Sea, and at this point leading them in the wilderness, through all of this point, the people have now not just rebelled against God, but in essence, they have also rebelled against Moses. And that's what God is saying here. These are a prideful people. They are stiff-necked. They do not learn. Notice the promise given, "Let my wrath burn against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." So he's given a law. He's now given a promise that God is going to preserve him for his faithfulness. And you might think to yourself here that as a leader, this is a point where Moses is going to become very prideful. Well, we notice there in verse 11, Moses' response is to plead with the Lord. He said, "Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, 'He brought them', out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth. Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have spoken of, I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. And here we see a certain level of wisdom that comes out from Moses, right? A level of wisdom in which Moses is not just concerned about his own condition, but he's also concerned about the conditions of others. When you think about people that are wise are not going to be individuals who look out simply for themselves. They're going to look out for the rest of those that are around them. And in Moses' case, those that are underneath him, that are expected to follow after him. Now, it's easy to say all these things from Moses' perspective when he's not having to confront Aaron, when he's not having to confront the actual people that are responsible for this. And so while Moses pleads for God to forgive them here, we follow and move down in this passage, we're going to see another opportunity for Moses to grow. Verse 19, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and it says that as soon as he came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, so that Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Now, I don't know what Moses would have looked like doing this. Obviously, this is an artist's depiction of what it looked like, but I can imagine that if somebody's mad enough to take something, to throw it, and to break it, then that person's going to be extremely upset. You know, sometimes you'll see this on the sidelines. I saw it yesterday watching college football where the referee makes a bad call or misses an obvious call, and you'll see the coach or whatever take his headset and throw it to the ground, or take his visor or his hat and throw it to the ground. And you can see the anger that is there on their, you can see the anger and the expression that's on their face. You get the same idea that this is what Moses looks like. Willing to take the actual law of God, the physical copy of it, throws it, and it breaks at the foot of the mountain. And then, obviously, he goes and burns the calf, but then notice that response, verse 21, Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you, that you have brought so great a sin upon them? And Aaron said, do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out. And in Moses' mind, you can imagine just how angry he would be at this point. He's just broken the law of God, and now his brother has given him this excuse that this golden calf that has led the people to idolatry just magically appeared out of a fire. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in this position where, put yourself in Moses' position. If you had been responsible, if you had sacrificed a lot of your wealth, a lot of your possessions, a lot of your time to lead this people to a new land, only for them to now suddenly turn on you as soon as you depart from them for a brief moment, you would be extremely angry. Most people would be extremely angry. And to top it off, you've got your brother who's responsible for this that makes up some ridiculous excuse for why everything has happened. You would be extremely, extremely angry. Now, in verse 25 and down through verse 29, Moses is going to deal with those individuals, right, who were responsible for it. As we talked about with Josiah, the leader of Israel had a responsibility to deal with those who had led the people to idolatry. But I want you to notice that you see Moses' wisdom come out in verse 30 because his anger suddenly turns to compassion. where it says that on the next day that Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin, so now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." And so Moses has the mindset that he wants this sin to be forgiven of the people. And that took a lot of change. It took a lot of development for Moses to learn that you can't just always be angry and you can't always be severe with his people, but you've also got to have compassion behind it. Now, I think about what Moses is doing here. I think about that for us as Christians, where, we know what God says. We study the Bible. We know what God expects of us. We know what God expects of the world. And sometimes we get angry with individuals in the world, people in our own family, people that we consider to be our friends. We get angry with them because we cannot understand why. We understand God's directives are simple and easy to follow. We follow them. We can't understand why they will not obey and do what God said. And sometimes that may make us frustrated and angry. But part of wisdom and learning wisdom is what's evident by Moses, that yes, you can be frustrated with these people, but you've also got to have compassion on them. And you've got to show that compassion toward them. When you think about evangelism and things like that, and when you're trying to talk to others about the gospel, yes, you've got to be very clear. You've got to be very strong in what you believe, but you also have to have compassion behind that if you truly want them to obey the gospel. Moses understood that here. You get rid of the people responsible for idolatry, but if you want the people to actually stay on the right path, to not seek after idolatry, you've got to show compassion. So Moses prays for the forgiveness of these people, or at least goes and pleads with God to forgive them. Likewise, as we talk to others about the gospel, as we deal with others who are living in sin, we've got to remember that we've got to have compassion for those individuals, that we want them to be saved, even when we may not understand and are frustrated with the decisions that they make. Moses learned or obeyed the call to learn, and he gained wisdom as a person who would care for his people despite of what they had done. And then finally, the call to be diligent. And we want to move forward in time now to Numbers 25. At this point, years have passed in the life of Moses. Moses is a much older man. We surmise that he also has grown wiser, at least hopefully he has. But Moses is going to be reminded here of the call to be diligent in Numbers 25. And he's going to be reminded of this call, of this need to be diligent now, not based on his own action, but from learning of the action of a younger man. In Numbers 25, the people of Israel had once again returned to idolatry, this time to the specific idolatry of Moab, where Israelite men had married Moabite women and essentially accepted the religious practices of the Moabites. And God's command, like in Exodus 32, is to take those who've committed idolatry and administer punishment. And as is evident by the Old Testament, the punishment is, for those that had practiced idolatry according to the law of Moses, that punishment was death. Verses 4 and 5, you see Moses administer that punishment. But the problem is that they're not very diligent with that. Because in verse 6, there was one specific Israelite man and a Midianite woman who had not been put away, that Moses and Aaron had not taken care of. But notice that in verse 7, that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it. He rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. We had talked about all the good things that Moses had done up to this point, how he had learned a lot. But this is a point where Moses had not been diligent, or at least to his best efforts, had not been diligent at removing this problem. The plague had gone on. It had killed people in Israel, and Moses had not been diligent in this, so that it took Phinehas, basically the great nephew of Moses, to actually deliver the final measure of justice or judgment to help take away this plague. And so Moses learned here that he had to be wary of contentment. Moses could have thought to himself, I've done a lot, I've grown a lot as a leader of Judah or as a leader of Israel. But we know that the overall point is that Moses' directive, his mission, was to take them to the land of Israel. And that's something obviously that he worked his whole life to do. But the point is that Moses' job was not finished until, as we see at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' mission was not finished until his death. And he was expected to be diligent in following out that mission for the rest of his life. And the point that stands out to us from that is that in order for us to be diligent, in order for us to grow in wisdom, we've got to come to the understanding that what God expects of us is something that should take the course of our entire life. When God asks us to be faithful, when he asks us to be workers in the vineyard, as Jesus would use as a reference to the church, that wasn't just for a brief time of service. That wasn't just for a set number of years in which you are going to work within the church. When we answered that call, as Moses did, God expects of us to work until the end of our lives for him. To whatever and to the best of our ability, God expects of us to finish out the task, even in light of the fact that that task is going to take us the rest of our lives to complete. And thus, we have to be diligent. Moses had to be reminded of that by his great nephew. We need to take from this the idea that God expects us to finish the job all the way until the end of our own lives, of our time here on earth, to be diligent. And sometimes it takes wisdom to recognize the idea that God is not going to reward us based on solely our past, but he's going to reward us based on what we are doing right now for him. So we need to be active in that regard. And we can simply conclude that we will not grow in wisdom in any of those steps unless, as James says, we are asking for the wisdom that only God can give. And if we follow through with that, the point is that we're going to have the wisdom to continue to persevere and finish to the end for the Lord. Of course, I cannot finish if I have not started my task for the Lord. To do that, again, I need to obey the gospel through hearing the word, believing in Jesus, repenting of my sins, confessing Christ, and being baptized. But like what we saw from the life of Moses, following after the Lord is a lifelong process in which we cannot stop at the end of our lives. When we feel like we've done enough for the Lord, God expects us to finish all the way. And sometimes we don't do that for whatever reason. And in that case, we can